Panworks, bringing ethics to life. Welcome to Pan Thinks, the podcast of Panworks, an ethics and policy center dedicated to animal well-being. I'm Bill Lynn, your host for the pod. Tonight, we welcome Nandita Bajaj, Executive Director of Population Balance, to share her thoughts on addressing the impact of human population pressures on animals. Nandita is the Executive Director of Population Balance, a U.S. nonprofit that works to inspire narrative, behavioral, and system change to shrink our human impact and elevate the rights and well-being of people, animals, and the planet. You can check them out at populationbalance.org. Welcome to our pod, Nandita. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you so much, Bill, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to see everyone in the audience.
Yes, we're going to have a good discussion, and we're really looking forward to your presentation. But before we jump into the presentation, I'd just like to ask a personal question of how did you get interested in this line of work? What motivated you to get into thinking about the relationship between human population and the well-being of people, animals, and nature?
Yeah, so I'd like to actually start by sharing the title of an article that a close friend of mine recently wrote, and it's called How to Lose Friends and Influence Very Few People. And I found it to be a funny article that applied very well to the kind of work that I feel I'm attracted to. And I very recently, I became an animal rights advocate about 7 to 8 years ago. And as if I had not lost enough friends, I decided to then come into sustainable population advocacy work, which is, again, a very controversial issue, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. But personally, for me, population was a very visceral experience. It was a very obvious thing to talk about. It was something everyone spoke about. I grew up in the most populous nation in the world, India, it is today. When I was born, it was the second most populous nation. And it was a very common thing that people would speak about, that there is, extreme crowding, density, really high density, a lack of valuing of human rights in terms of just how the inequities between the rich and the poor were, and the environmental degradation situation, the pollution of the air and the land, etc. And of course, the rights and the plight of animals was also extremely poor. There was kind of this hierarchy in the way that we looked at, if humans don't even have really good rights, why would we even begin to look at animals? I know there are teachings from within India that look at animals in, more kind of ethical ways, but that was not my personal upbringing. I grew up in a very urban environment. Fast forward, I moved to Canada with my parents in my late teens. I was a very mainstream student. I did very mainstream things for a number of years. I became an engineer. I worked in engineering for several years. I became very interested in environmental issues in my early adulthood, and the concept of minimalism. And, I was starting to explore that on the side. And at university, while I was studying engineering, I took some courses in the psychology of gender and gender norms. And it had already started piquing my interest in the concept of social norms and what people are expected to do and how they are expected to fulfill them. Mm-hmm. I'll fast forward a few years. I switched out of engineering, became interested in teaching. So I taught high school for about 10 years. And within that, I was looking at the stuff that I was teaching, science and ecology and math and technology, and how much focus there was on STEM and technological solutions to the environmental crisis.
Mm.
And I was totally, I think, biased growing up that technology was the answer to a lot of our issues, and science and technology are the solutions to addressing those issues. I wasn't really learning much about or teaching much about ecology or ecocentrism or the embeddedness of humans and non-humans within nature. It was very much this individuated, more neoliberal idea of everyone is just going to go out and be successful and make your own pathway. And I was feeding that narrative as a teacher. And as I started to explore more on the side my own interest, I was also in a serious relationship with my partner at the time, who's now my husband, and we both shared environmental concern and minimalism. And he asked me early on, as we were becoming serious, if I wanted to have kids or not. And it was a question that I had never been asked or never even considered. My response to him was, don't we have to? And it was kind of a really like an awakening moment for me, because I mean, his response was, no, we can do whatever we choose to do that aligns with our values. And we both decided within a minute that we weren't going to have kids. But that question really stayed with me of how is it that as a feminist, as an independent thinker, working in a non-traditional field, that I had never even questioned the possibility of not having children, and how many other people were there like me who thought of that decision to be an inevitability. And those who wanted to embark upon parenthood, how much choice did they really have? How much informed decision-making power did they really have to engage in that decision responsibly? And so that started kind of expanding my field of interest more and more. And a few years later, I became interested in animal rights. So everything was kind of expanding into this, like looking at the connection between population pressures, which was a big part of my upbringing, pronatalism, this kind of unwritten rule that population growth is good, that everyone must have children in large families, depending on the degree of traditional or progressive communities people come from. And then the plight of animals under the growth of the human enterprise, which has become so huge. So I went back to school. I left teaching. I went back to school to do my graduate degree in humane education. And it's a field of study that looks at the connection between human rights, animal protection, and environmental sustainability. And how do we propose pathways forward to global issues that elevate all three of them, that don't elevate one while trump another. And that degree led to my finding this position as the executive director of population balance. And I also teach at the Institute for Humane Education at Antioch on these very issues.
Wow, what a journey. What a journey. Well, let's hear a little bit of the fruit of your journey. Let's start the actual seminar part, shall we?
All right. So today I'm talking about addressing the impacts of human population pressures on animals. In my work, I look at how human population pressures impact reproductive rights, children's rights, human rights, environmental ethics. But today I'm particularly talking about animals and animal protection, just because of the nature of PanWorks. I spoke briefly about the lens through which I approach the issues, which is a humane education lens. How do we find pathways forward that consider all three things, humans, animals, and nature? Obviously considering, as Pan does in its beautiful logo, that humans and non-humans are embedded within nature. We are all part of one large ecosystem. So, outline today's, I'll spend some time talking about how humans have become the most dominant species on Earth. Why is it so difficult to talk about population? How did it become a taboo? I can assume, even within our audience today, that so many people would be uncomfortable talking about population. That is the case for most of the circles I hang out in, progressive circles, animal rights, reproductive rights. There is a real hesitation and nervousness to talk about population. So we'll talk about why is that there, what are some good reasons, and what are some bad reasons for that taboo to exist. And then how do we move toward a future or a pathway forward that elevates. In today's talk, I'm only talking about reproductive and ecological justice, but really in my work, we're looking at large scale, system change for justice and liberation for all. So human expansionism, a very brief history, is here I have a graph that dates back 12,000 years, but we have been around for obviously a lot longer, 250 to 300,000 years. And for most of our history, we've existed and lived as gatherer-hunter societies. But what's notable about this time is it was right after the last ice age that we started to live in settlement societies. And it's also the beginning of when we started engaging in the domestication of animals and plants. I'm assuming most people are very familiar with that history, so I won't spend too much time on that. But it was, from our perspective, really the break between the human and non-human divide that occurred was at that time when we began taking full control over the life and death of animals and what they did during their lives, including their fertility, including reproduction, etc. A lot of things have happened in the last 10,000 years, but today I'm only talking about a few major events. It was around 6,000 years ago when patriarchy is also assumed to have started with the rise of empires and states, when elites were looking to form early states, and a lot of social hierarchies are believed to have begun at that time, including the gendered division of roles. And I will go into that part a little bit later, but it is crucial to my presentation today. And then it was about 200 years ago with the discovery of fossil fuels, cheap, abundant energy, that human population, which had been hovering under a million to under between 1 to 5 million for most of human history, so 99.9% of human history, our population remained below 5 million, which is the population of my city in Toronto. Now, the Greater Toronto area is about 5 million. That was the entire globe's population. So we were a small part of the rich, biodiverse planet. And then it took us a long time to get to our first billion, which happened around 1800. And with the access to cheap, abundant energy, our population exploded over the last 200 years from 1 billion to 8 billion. A lot of ecologists and scientists would call this behavior in terms of one species out of so many, like a species out of context, what has happened here. a species that has grown abnormally with no negative feedbacks. So I'm going to play a little clip from a podcast interview that we did with ecologist William Rees. And he talks about just these last 200 years and what they represent.
I think it's really interesting to look historically at this whole question of growth, because for all intents and purposes, there was none for 250,000 years. In just the last 200 years, we've seen more change than in the previous entire history of human beings. Only 10 generations of human beings out of thousands have experienced this phenomenon of growth. Growth in population, growth in technology, in sufficient quantity so that they would notice in the course of their lifetimes. And so it's really a very, very recent phenomenon. But because all of us alive today and for the past few generations have been embedded within this growth dynamic, we take it to be the norm. And therefore, we project ourselves into the future as if it can continue forever. But the fact is that this is the single most abnormal period in human history. It's completely unprecedented, never occurred before, and can never occur again.
It was also Dr. William Rees who came up with the concept that many of you may be familiar with of ecological footprint, which is a way of measuring how much we're demanding from the planet versus how much the planet can sustainably offer. So ecological overshoot is the basically definition of how we have overshot our carrying capacity. So at this time, we are demanding 75% more from Earth than Earth can sustainably provide. And of course, we don't have an extra 0.75 planet. We're not importing anything from other planets. So where that extra 75% is coming from is we're really stealing resources and habitats from other species and from future generations, both human and non-human. And in the last 200 years, as our population grew by a factor of 8 from 1 billion to 8 billion, our consumption grew by a factor of 100. So both these things have completely exploded, but you can also see the rate of consumption is not only so enormous, but it's also very unequally distributed. So if you look at the distribution of resources globally, these graphics, they show how per capita, per person, if everyone lived like an average US citizen, we would need 5 Earths. So right now we're demanding as a global population 1.7 Earths. But if you divide that up within countries and how each individual is consuming, you can see the discrepancy and the inequitable distribution between consumption patterns. An average US citizen versus an average Brazilian or an average Indian citizen, it's really unequal and inequitable. And so that obviously is a huge part of our ecological overshoot issue. And often this conversation is where things stop. When we talk about population and human expansionism, this question comes up. Is it really population? Isn't it the consumption of the richest countries? I mean, I just showed you the graph. Of course it is. But the question really is that it's both. It's a false dichotomy to say consumption matters more than population. Of course, consumption matters, but people who are living in substandard living conditions aren't choosing to live that way and deserve to raise their standard of living. And people who are living exorbitant lives, like an average US citizen or Australian or where I am in Canada, need to really pull back on the level of consumption. Both things need to be happening. But if you also look at where the largest population of poor people resides, it's in communities. Again, it's in communities that need to raise their standard of living. And if you take a really large number, and if you improve the standard of living even by a tiny bit, you can see what the multiplication of population times consumption is. It would be humongous. In fact, I'll show you. First, I'll show you what some of the arguments often come up around this discourse. So, a Union of Concerned Scientists have a statement on their website. We're sometimes asked, isn't population growth driving climate change? But that's the wrong question, and it can lead to dangerous answers. Another statement by Catherine Hayhoe, who's a chief scientist with the Nature Conservancy, recently said in an interview, it's not the number of people, but it's how we live, meaning we can keep adding more people. And if we just bring down our consumption of the rich countries, then we will be all okay. Another one by George Monbiot, who is quite a popular journalist, writes for The Guardian, an environmental advocate, even an animal advocate. People who claim that population growth is the big environmental issue are shifting the blame from the rich to the poor. And of course, these narratives exist because there are partial truths to their statements, but they are also exaggerations to what the real ecological issue is. And I will, of course, unpack why they are talking about things like dangerous answers or isn't causing climate change. Well, actually, let's look at that one. So, overpopulation, which is not a very popular word, but if you look at it from an ecological perspective, which we do, and we're trying to reclaim the word as a species among many species that has overshot its carrying capacity, it's a scientific fact. It's not some kind of ideology that a bunch of people are saying there's too many people. The United Nations, many of the agencies within the UN, including the IPCC, the top agency talking about climate change, identifies both population and consumption as the drivers of climate change, the strongest two drivers of climate change. We've had several scientist warnings, papers signed by tens of thousands of scientists, the Royal Society in the UK. And we're not just talking about climate change, we're talking about other issues that are a subset of ecological overshoot. Climate change, of course, has become the dominant issue that everyone is talking about, partially because it impacts humans directly. But one can argue that species extinction and the loss of biodiversity are even more dire conditions that most people are not talking about because it doesn't immediately impact humans. So it's an irrefutable fact that it's an issue. A lot of scientists and researchers will go out of their way to write papers to say population is not an issue, and this is why it doesn't affect biodiversity, this is why it doesn't affect climate. But that nervousness or that anxiety or that dodge is really based on an ideology or fear of being conflated with some kind of a negative perspective of people who talk about population they mean something, they're pointing fingers, they're racist, etc. So let's, instead of avoiding the issue because it's a difficult issue, because it has a difficult past, I think it's so important for us to engage in difficult conversations and move forward in a way that looks at justice-oriented solutions, and that is what we do in our work, because it's not helping humans or animals or the planet to remain in denial of the issue. The other argument against what some of those population denial statements are claiming is that it's really the rich world that is responsible for all of these issues. Like I said, folks living in substandard living conditions don't choose to live that way, and most people aspire to a North American standard of living. In fact, if you look at this chart, the global middle class in this decade, by 2030, currently the global middle class is just over 4 billion. Within the next 6 years, we're adding another 1 billion new people to the global middle class. These are people who desire animal products for food, take flights, own cars, have bigger houses, people who live like an average Canadian or US citizen. 90% of the next people entering the middle class are from Asia, right? These are two of the most populous countries, India and China. And the current population of US is about 380 million, if I'm correct. It's around that. That small fraction of new middle class consumers who are now joining the rest of the global middle class represents the size of US population, right? And that's a tiny portion of the Indian population, and that's only till 2030. Imagine what this number is going to be in 2040 and 2050. And of course, those of us who are concerned about social justice, we would say, well, this is a very good thing, because people who have not had access to a good standard of living are now entering that. But what does it mean for Earth? What does it mean for our common future when Earth and nature are pushing back in really vicious ways, such as through extreme climate events? So let's talk about why is it so difficult to discuss population. There are 3 reasons. From our perspective, I think there are many, many reasons, but there are 3 that we at Population Balance have kind of zoomed in on. And the first one we look at is the ideology or worldview of human supremacy. I'll also talk about past policies. And the third one, which is my area of research, is pronatalism. So human supremacy, the definition of it from our board director, Dr. Eileen Christ, is a worldview that esteems the human as a distinguished entity that is superior to all other life forms and is entitled to use them in the places they live. It's, of course, got roots in religion, in the age of enlightenment. I know you've had guests who've spoken about the concept of the human and non-human divide, and how many layers of ideology and history are attached to human supremacy. But today it is almost a globalized worldview. It's a worldview that has been exported to so many communities as we have exported other ideas of Western development and growthism, right? Pushing out a lot of notions and knowledge systems of previous traditions and indigenous communities. So unfortunately, this has become a very globalized worldview. I asked Dr. Bill Rees to explain how human exceptionalism or human supremacy fits within this worldview of ecology. And he's answering my question in this clip.
Sure. I think it's really important to emphasize something that you've alluded to here, and that is that human beings are storytellers. We don't live in reality the way other species do. we make up stories and then we live out of those confections as if they were the real thing. And exceptionalism, the word you used, is one of those stories. So it's a philosophical concept, I suppose, with deep roots in religion, but it subscribes to the belief that human beings are outside of nature. We're not like other organisms. Many people don't like to think of themselves as animals, for example. And once you've developed a story that puts you outside of nature, then clearly you are, I suppose, liberated from the laws of nature, biophysics, physics, and so on and so forth. So here we are, a species that is unique in the world as far as we know, in that it considers itself to be not part of the system of which it is deeply a part. So the story deviates enormously from the reality. And I think that's a major source of many of our problems.
And there are many ways in which human exceptionalism or human supremacy shows up. And I think a lot of folks in the audience are very familiar with those. But even in looking at the ways in which we are driving other species into extinction through our activities of agriculture and logging and keeping animals in captivity in factory farms for food, practices such as hunting. Before I go into hunting and fishing, I'm going to go a little deeper into this. So this graphic actually shows how over the last 50 years, so in 1970, human population was at 4 billion. Today, it's 8 billion. We have doubled in just the last 50 years. The demand for animal food products has almost quadrupled during that time. And remember, I showed the graphic of how the rise of the middle class is happening mainly in Asia. And during the last 50 years, as the middle class consumers from Asia have risen, the demand for meat products has increased by 10, a factor of 10. And that is expected to double. This demand for animal food products. So currently there are 80 billion land animals that are killed for animal products. That is expected to double by 2050 in just the next 30 years as more and more people enter the middle class. And of course, it's not like population growth has stopped. We're expected to add another 2.5 billion more people to the planet. And the same goes for seafood production. You will be very familiar with this graphic, that of all mammals on Earth, if you look at the biomass or the weight of all mammals, wild are a mere 4% compared to we and the animals that we kill for food that make up 96%. 10,000 years ago, when I showed you that graph, when we started engaging in the domestication of animals, that number, so this number, the number of animals killed for food, was 0 because we weren't domesticating animals. We were engaging in hunting, of course, but not in this way. This number, the number of humans, so biomass by weight, like mammals by weight, humans represented 1%, the wild represented 99%. And today that's only 4%. So that is what has happened in terms of the rise and expansion of the human enterprise and us becoming the dominant predator. Hunting and fishing is another way in which we exploit and dominate animals, whether it's for food, for body parts, for human artifacts, or for superstitious or medicinal uses. And the trends in terms of how the wild populations have been affected over the last 50 years since our population doubled from 4 to 8 billion is the average trends in studied wildlife populations decreased by 68%. In terms of freshwater population, a decrease of 84%. And of course, if you just look at what we have done to a rich biodiverse planet, we've literally paved over it with lots of concrete, our highways, our buildings, our transportation devices, infrastructure, etc. And that has come at the expense of habitats for other non-humans who are literally being pushed away and even to extinction. So that's one aspect of the population taboo, is the idea that we think that we are the only species that matters. We can continue to grow. There are a lot of people saying, well, of course, growth is great. And that really comes because of a disregard of our place in nature and our symphony with non-human beings, which has been part of our existence for 99.9% of our existence. The second aspect of the population taboo, and it's probably the one that most people here are familiar with, is past policies. So population really became a societal issue after the Second World War. The UN was formed. There was great discourse in the UN that population was a real issue in terms of helping to eradicate poverty and help, with social services and elevating human rights. And there were a lot of policies that were put into place to help reduce populations in different countries. And it was recognized correctly that population growth was happening as a result of patriarchal and religious norms and pressures that prevented people, especially women, from having reproductive autonomy, that pushed women to have lots of children for other demographic goals, such as more religious followers or myths around contraceptives, abortions, etc. So most of the policies that were put into place in places as diverse as Costa Rica, Bangladesh, Iran, Morocco, and many, many more, were actually empowering rights-valuing methods that worked miraculously in decreasing the fertility rate from about 5 children per woman on average to less than 2 in a matter of decades. And it was all through empowering policies that made education, family planning, counseling, contraceptives accessible to people and confronted a lot of these harmful norms. But of course, there were a number of policies, such as, I think most people are familiar with, China's one-child policy, forced sterilization campaigns in places like Puerto Rico and even in India a few years before I was born there. And within Europe and US, we were also around within the same century seeing separate, differently motivated eugenic policies. They weren't really motivated by population as they were by racial purity. But because they were happening around that same time, a lot of people were obviously influenced by some of that thinking. But interestingly, a lot of population discourse became conflated with that type of discourse, even though population discourse was motivated by environmental and human rights concern. And so these policies that obviously were absolutely horrible and must be denounced ended up becoming the kind of the definition of what it means to talk about population. They became conflated with all population discourse. And even though majority of the population policies were family planning policies, they got drowned out by the attention that was given to China's one-child policy. I have done a number of, I've written a number of articles, but if people are interested in delving more deeply into the history over the last 70, 80 years of how the toxification of population discourse happened, I recommend listening to this episode with Dr. Diana Koo, who's done a full genealogy over the last many decades. Another paper I recommend is the one that I recently co-authored with two of my colleagues, is Confronting the United Nations Pro-Growth Agenda, Call to Reverse Ecological Overshoot, where we go into how even some of the United Nations agencies have bought into kind of this pro-growth agenda and moved away from population discourse. So here are logos of some institutes that you may have heard of: American Enterprise, Cato, Foundation for Economic Education, the Heritage Foundation. A lot of these are what are known as market fundamentalist organizations or neoliberal think tanks. And the reason I show this is because a few years ago, not a few, but many years ago, there was a book written by Dr. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called Merchants of Doubt. And another one, The Petroleum Papers, that showed how a lot of climate denial was actually being fueled by these organizations, with funding from folks like the Koch brothers. What I want to show here also is part of the discourse of population becoming so toxified also had to do with the involvement of the Vatican, as well as a lot of neoliberal mainstream economists and market fundamentalists in these population conferences. So there were feminists, reproductive rights advocates who were at these population conferences saying, hey, we can't talk about population because, hey, look what happened with China's one-child policy. Or look what happened with forced sterilization. Anytime people talk about population, that's where people go. It's top-down government control. Which it wasn't, right? It was a few examples where it happened, and then there were all these amazing policies that got completely pushed aside. But also people that were present at these conferences were the Vatican, who have a vested interest in banning contraceptives and abortion, and market fundamentalists who had a vested interest in promoting the idea of economic growth and free market fundamentalism. And why growth was needed in all these countries for development to happen. Of course, it was, it was a way for a lot of these Western powers to start engaging in kind of neocolonial policies to extract much of the resources. But the reason I bring this up is because these folks have played a really huge role in perpetuating population denial. Why would an organization that is interested in market fundamentalism put out things, titles, reports like this? Earth overpopulation is a myth we should all ignore. Busting the myth of overpopulation, the myth that our planet faces an overpopulation crisis. Now, none of these organizations have a history in demography, reproductive rights, access to family planning, children's rights. They are purely market fundamentalist organizations. What are they doing writing about population being a myth? It's the exact same denial that they played into with climate. And we actually did an interview with Naomi Oreskes for our podcast on this, and she explains why these organizations are engaging in this kind of rhetoric.
Why would an organization like the Cato Institute or the Foundation for Economic Education say that overpopulation is a myth? Well, these are organizations whose central activities is to promote libertarian ideology in order to push back against government action in the marketplace. We do know that many of these organizations are heavily, heavily funded by Fortune 500 companies, captains of industries, who stand to benefit from weak government regulation. And so if we say population is a serious issue, in part because of the destruction of biodiversity, the destruction of habitat, pushing up against planetary limits, coerced reproduction of many women across the world, there's a whole set of issues here that invite a conversation about governance, about the role of governments, and also about governance through NGOs, local institutions, etc. And all of these things point to the need for planning, thinking about the future and figuring out what are appropriate responses. They hate planning because they associate planning with socialism.
So that's a little background on how market fundamentalists actually entered the discourse and toxified it further and exaggerated the past history of population policies. In fact, as I said, efforts to lower birth rates, which really only began in the last 50 years, mainly through empowering policies of family planning, were like they pale in comparison to the thousands of years of efforts to increase birth rates, which has been a result of patriarchal norms and institutionalized pronatalism, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So I mentioned that this happened about 6,000 years ago, the start of patriarchy and social hierarchies, especially gender hierarchies, subjugation of women. We interviewed a journalist, Angela Saini, who recently wrote a book, The Patriarchs. And here she talks about how population and patriarchy are completely intertwined.
The idea of a gender division of labor is actually a relatively recent one. The big turning point comes with the emergence of the first states. That's at least where we can see it in the record very clearly. You can imagine in those very early states, what were the big concerns of the elites who were trying to form those states? Obviously, population must have been very high up that agenda, because if you're creating a society in which you need people to create a surplus for those at the top, in which you need people to be available to defend the state and die for it if necessary, then you need people. They are the number one valuable commodity right throughout history. So, of course, over these thousands of years, you see pressure fall on young women to have as many children as possible, which in hunter-gatherer societies, otherwise they do not do. And also pressure falls on young men to be available to defend the state.
So that brings me to the next aspect of my work, which is pronatalism, also kind of the last thing I'm talking about in the population taboo. The definition of pronatalism, author Laura Carroll, who wrote the book, The Baby Matrix, maybe in current day and age, it can be seen as the idea that parenthood and raising children should be the central focus of every person's adult life. It is a strong social force and includes a collection of beliefs so embedded that they've come to be seen as true. Challenging pronatalism is not challenging parenthood. It's actually challenging the ideology that everyone needs to follow a certain path, especially as dictated by institutions of power. What are the institutions of power that benefit from population growth, and how people experience them? Well, there are, of course, cultural pressures that have become internalized because of millennia of institutionalized pressures through religion that seeks more followers, corporations, capitalist economies that are looking for more consumers, politicians and nation states that are looking for more taxpayers, a larger military, or a bigger ethnocentric population to outcompete other ethnic populations. And so cultural pressures really show up probably in the most intense ways for people, from family and relatives and peers. So people, especially women who are unable to have children or refuse to have children, can be really deeply stigmatized. They can be disowned from their families. They can be divorced, experience domestic violence, experience economic marginalization, again, depending on the degree of patriarchy that you exist within. But these pressures are all around us, and they really are the water in which we are swimming. I'd like to show a somewhat lighthearted clip on pronatalism, which talks about serious issues, but presents it in a nice way. It's a film called My So-Called Selfish Life. And here's a little trailer.
Nobody doesn't want kids.
People cannot want kids. It's a thing.
That is not a thing.
Well, it's my thing.
I've known since high school that I did not want to be a mother.
At one point, you just declared that if I ever want to have grandchildren, don't look at me.
I didn't really ever want kids, but I always assumed I would have them.
I kept asking myself, is this going to happen to me? Does it have to happen?
What does it mean to live in a world where motherhood is our destiny? And what happens if we say no?
Remember, your biological clock is ticking.
I gotta have a baby. I gotta have a baby. I gotta have a baby.
Do you have a biological clock?
Not ticking within me, so the answer would have to be no.
There's no biological reason for that to happen.
You could list any number of honors and degrees, and somebody will still think that you're not fully accomplished if you haven't had a child.
Motherhood has increased in value yet again. It's almost fetishized in our society.
This is the real solution to climate change. Babies.
Nations need childbirths.
Babies are good for the economy.
This is by design, this life. I'm not missing anything. I didn't forget to have kids. I'm just not interested.
To have somebody tell you you don't know what's best for you is extremely condescending and insulting.
Never question my African identity because I'm child free.
You can be an aunt or an uncle to your friends' children, and you'll be fine. In fact, you'll be great.
Don't forget to take your pill. I won't.
And so I'm now going to move into, well, what does it look like? You know, those are cultural pressures, but how do they really show up in culture and media narratives? These are headlines within the last year of what certain countries are doing. Iran ends provision by state of contraceptives and vasectomies. Iran is known as an exemplar when it came to incredible population family planning policies. And because of greater gender equality during a certain period, the fertility declined from like above 5 to less than 2 in 10, 15 years. And now they are so worried that fertility is declining, that the society is becoming more gender equal, that people are not having kids, that they are resorting to things like ending contraceptives and vasectomies. Turkey is pushing for 3 children. You get a baby bonus. In Hungary, you pay no income tax for life if you have babies, but you have to be a heterosexual couple to have access to this. Putin will give you an award for a Mother Heroine Award if you have 10 or more children for the state. China has now instituted a 3-child policy after engaging in the one-child policy. Now it's pushing people to have children by taking away reproductive rights. Japan's blaming feminism for a nation's falling populations. And of course, in our own country, and I say our own because my organization's based in the US, but in the US, of course, we are seeing a backsliding of reproductive rights happening through the institutionalization of abortion bans and sanctions on contraceptives. All of that because our fertility recently has started to decline because of greater gender equality. So you can see the institutions of power that have benefited for so many thousands of years, suddenly, as fertility has started to decline for the very first time in our history because of greater gender equality, are feeling threatened because they're not going to have the right number of people for their maintaining these institutions of power. Before I go there, important to recognize that globally, nearly half of all pregnancies are unintended. And almost 750 million women and girls that are alive today were married as children. So if we're not talking about population and access to family planning policies, which over the last few decades, 30 years since we stopped talking about population, the funding for family planning policies decreased significantly because people were like, well, it's just not an issue anymore. Let's put our money somewhere else. Even today, more than 200 million women do not have access to modern contraceptives who wish to avoid a pregnancy and cannot. And two of the most influential people in the world are sending the exactly wrong message. Elon Musk, the richest person on earth, believes that population collapse of humans, not species extinction, he's talking about human population collapse, due to low birth rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. He thinks that our urge to have sex and to procreate has been subverted by birth control and abortion, leading to population decline. Therefore, if we were to take away birth control and abortion, we would end up where we were always meant to be. And of course, Pope Francis has something to say about population as well. He's ringing alarm bells about how fertility is declining in all of these countries, and we need to do something about it. And he calls it a form of selfishness that people aren't having the right number of kids. In fact, some of them are having dogs and cats that are taking the place of children, and that's even more selfish. So, a lot of people, when they first hear about pronatalism, they automatically think that challenging pronatalism means that we're advocating for antinatalism. Antinatalism is, of course, a worldview that believes that it's unethical to procreate, that people should just stop reproducing because of many different philosophical reasons. We don't think that either pronatalism or antinatalism enhance reproductive autonomy. So we reject both of them. In fact, antinatalism is not the opposite of pronatalism. The opposite of pronatalism, standing up to patriarchal norms of pronatalism, is actually to advocate for reproductive autonomy and responsibility, believing that people have it in them to make the decisions that are right for them and their children and the planet, that we don't need state control, we don't need public shaming to be telling what people should be doing with their bodies. I'm going to skip this one, and I'm going to conclude with just a couple of slides, hoping that we can expand on this conversation during our discussion. So what does it mean to move toward a future that elevates both reproductive and ecological justice? What would it mean for individually for us to make decisions that consider the rights of potential children, the rights of non-human beings, planetary limits, but also what would it mean for policies to be embedded within justice narratives. So leading ecologists would say that a sustainable population size for human beings that is in balance with the rest of life on Earth, while still meeting human needs of sufficiency, is anywhere from 2 to 4 billion at a European standard of living. So not the outrageous United States standard and not the really low standard in very poor countries, somewhere in the middle. Some people will argue it's even lower than that, but 2 to 4 billion seems really achievable because 4 billion is where we were in 1975 in most of our lifetimes. 2 billion is where we were 100 years ago when my grandmother was born, who is still alive. So in her lifetime, she has seen the population grow from 2 to 4 to 8 billion. She's seen the population quadruple. So many of our ecologist friends and people who are working within reproductive rights believe that we can actually achieve that population within the century or shortly after this century if we actually seriously stand up to patriarchal, religious, pronatalist norms and really fight for true reproductive autonomy. These are the projections from the UN that say at current fertility rates, if we do nothing, we are expected to add another 2.5 billion people this century. If we were to increase our total fertility rate by just 0.5, so let's say like abortion bans become normalized in many, many places and there's coerced reproduction or child marriages become legalized in more places, that's the trajectory we see as we go to 15, 16 billion. Of course, it's not reasonable because Earth has negative feedback loops and we're never going to be able to get there because of extreme events that will, reduce our population in violent ways. But if we were to aim for what I said, really confronting these norms, we could go just by 0.5 decline in TFR, we could get to somewhere near 7 billion, or some people even think 3 billion by the end of this century, if we accelerate the fertility decline that we're seeing. So it's totally possible within rights-based means. And of course, what it means for our ecological justice as well. So what does it mean to be within reproductive ecological justice is that people have true procreative autonomy that is free from pronatalism, that our decisions consider the rights and well-being of our potential children. Our decisions consider our obligations towards others, including non-human beings, and our decisions are based on the reality of ecological and planetary boundaries. And here I'm obviously talking not just about individual decisions, but really how our policies should be premised on these things, not on GDP growth, which is currently what our policies are based on. So I'm going to end there. These are some of the different people we've interviewed on different subjects, on population denial. You might recognize some names, on human supremacy, on growthism and alternative economics, degrowth or ecological economics, and on pronatalism and patriarchy. We've got over 60 episodes, and so there's lots to choose from if you're interested in delving more deeply. But for now, I am going to stop here and open it up for our discussion. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. Fascinating conversation. Let me move to a view where I can see everybody. And We already have a hand who's up. Barbara King, please.
Adam, wasn't your hand up before? No. Okay. Well, thank you so much. That was just fascinating. And I'm particularly grateful for your explaining some of the reasons why there's a resistance to intense population control discourse. And that was very helpful for me to be able to make that explicit and concrete. I'm an anthropologist, and some of what I work with is resistance that I'm seeing to trying to control some so-called invasive populations of animals through birth control rather than through lethal management, and also resistance to spay-neuter of animal companions like cats and dogs because it goes against their autonomy. And I wondered if you see connections between those types of discourses and what you're talking about, or do you see them as separate?
First of all, Barbara, I'm a huge fan of your work, so it's great to be in contact with you. Thanks for your nice comments and also your question. In the conversations we've had with so many of our social scientists and anthropologists, I really do see as those two as deeply linked. First, I'll say that even in a recent conversation we had with animal lawyer, legal scholar Manisha Dekka, whom you might know.
Yes.
She made this connection, and of course, Carol Adams has made the connection between patriarchal commodification of women's bodies and commodification of animal bodies, and how they are very much linked. And that it was really the domestication of animals and the hierarchy that was created then that then allowed for all of these other hierarchies to emerge as well, including the sexual exploitation of women and coerced reproduction, as I spoke about today. But your question in particular, I won't speak from a place of authority on it, but I've thought about it. So I'll share what I think. I totally agree with you that in terms of, reducing populations of certain species that have become invasive because of our actions, the most compassionate pathway forward to do that is through what you mentioned, birth control, rather than culling and killing of these animals. I would love for us to get to a point in the future where domesticated animals like cats and dogs, which are also suffering from a overpopulation issue because of our actions and this commodification of how we view these certain animals, I think spay and neuter is the most humane form of how we get there. I don't even like to use control as a word anymore, because population control was really used as a way to coercively control. And so population reduction methods, and that's my view, I think for the next 50, 100 years, whatever it's needed for us to get to a point where in balance with the domesticated species and other animals where, hopefully we don't even have these domestic animals who are under our control. I feel like that is the most humane pathway forward, because they still get to live out their lives and enjoy their lives. And maybe they don't get to experience reproduction, but at least they don't lose their lives altogether. I think there are other people who've done more research on it, and I can look for them and connect you with them.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
You want to go, Adam?
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah, go.
Cool. Thanks, Nandita. Really interesting, and I certainly fall into the into the category of being uncomfortable about talking about this issue for sure. It's one of those things that I've always, I think I've just sort of pushed the line that you sort of explained quite well. It's not population, it's overconsumption, and I've then just moved past it quite quickly. But I found your presentation quite compelling, and certainly some of the stats are really impactful, definitely. So that's something I'm going to be reconsidering in my own approach to advocacy and how that fits into my advocacy around environmental issues and animals for sure. One thing and we talked about this a little bit before the show, but just the framing of this issue, just being able to get traction around this issue and have people even engage and come to and see this presentation, I think is a really big barrier to overcome. And you mentioned trying to reclaim the term overpopulation, the overpopulation project or whatever. And I just wonder whether that is if that term has been so sullied that it's not able to be overcome. Because I just, until I heard this talk, I would just sort of breeze past overpopulation stuff. I'd just be like dismissive. I'd be like, no, I'm not going to get into that. That's a bit too much. But and that's my bad. But I think a lot of people would have a very similar response. Have you got any thoughts on like how do you capture people without putting them off before they actually get consider it and think about it carefully?
It's a really important question, something we've been thinking about for a long time. And for me, the word overpopulation is simply a scientific word. It's an ecological word that applies to all species that overshoot their carrying capacity. And if we really look at it from a species-centered perspective in which we are not a supreme species or a special species for whom the term should not be used, then I say, from an ecocentric perspective, which is one of our pillars, it totally applies to human beings. And because population growth, seeing the presentation and understanding that population growth for millennia has been premised on the subjugation of girls and women for external demographic goals to kind of grow these institutional powers, I see overpopulation as like a feminist issue. I feel like it should become a feminist word. We would never have a population issue if we were simply allowed to make reproductive decisions freely and responsibly, if we weren't coerced and pushed into all of these schemes. But your point, of course, is that the reason it became so sullied is because of also the reason population discourse became taboo. Because in the 70s and 80s, a lot of discourse around population was coming from the global north or rich Western countries that were blaming poor countries for their high fertility rates. And so there is a history of racism within the movement. And not to say that people who talk about population today may not be coming from that place. I think any movement will have bad apples and good apples. But just because there are bad apples and there are poorly intentioned people doesn't mean the issue itself, which I think is a neutral issue, it's a scientific, it's an ecological issue, that the issue becomes censored. The issue needs to then be so carefully handled and moved forward with, rights and sustainability-based discourse. In terms of the title of our podcast, so here's the real story, is the podcast existed before I took over as the executive director of Population Balance, and the previous ED who had started the podcast had named it that as a way to say, nobody's talking about it and we're going to talk about it and we're going to reclaim it. And I totally appreciated the boldness and I stayed with that claim, and we're even going as far as claiming it as a feminist anti-oppression term. But your point about, the barrier that word presents to people, progressives, who just think, okay, overpopulation, they're even using the word overpopulation. Wasn't that word canceled a long time ago? Are they not with it? So I do feel that it probably is a barrier to a lot of people, and it's something we have been in conversation with people about, if we were to really look at how broad our podcast is, we talk about human supremacy, we talk about, techno-industrial capitalism and growth economies, social inequalities, pronatalism and patriarchy. It's probably not the term that captures all of those. But it's a tough place for us to be in because there's brand recognition and, but it's a conversation we are seriously having, is how do we not push people before they've even had a chance to hear us and see who we are. So thanks for bringing that up, because it I think emboldens our conversation a bit further. And I'd be interested in, if people want to put stuff in the chat, what you would have thought before this presentation about the name of the podcast, if you would have just dismissed it like Adam did.
If I can just intervene for a second. Adam, but turn your mic back on for a moment, please. How is it that you learned to think of a term like overpopulation in a negative way? Do you have a sense of where that came from?
Not really. No, I think it's just sort of like, I suppose, being part of the environmental movement and for, a couple of decades now, and you just sort of absorb certain norms. And another one that I've sloughed off recently is anti-nuclear power and anti-nuclear energy. And that was something I just held as not good for a long time, because that's sort of what I was getting from other environmentalists in environmental advocacy in particular. And I think that same thing is true of the population debate. And it's not so much that it was like that I don't agree that there's an issue with population. It's just not something you talk about, because it's all the stuff that Nandita mentioned, that it focused. I tend to see it as this sort of racist approach by, it was always like the couple of old blokes that are about 70 sitting at their stand saying at the environmental fair, saying that populations in other countries need to stop having babies and stuff like that. That's how I associated it. So it's sort of like, I don't know, and then it's just it's a hard topic. It's a hard topic that then just gets dismissed. So why bother with the conversation if it's just not going to go anywhere? But this is all sort of my issue, I suppose, that I've taken this and not critically assessed it and focused more on, say, animal issues and stuff. But they're definitely very much intertwined. And I think there's, the level of overlap in terms of population and, say, when we talk about non-native species or species that we might deem invasive, like that we even call them invasive may be because we have taken so much habitat because of human population growth and animal agricultural land use, that then it's easier to deem them invasive and vilify and change them and target them rather than look at our own selves and work on ourselves. But yeah, and I suppose it's just within environmental science, if I think about colleagues, other scientists, it's not a topic that you broach, or if you broach it, you sort of get, and this is like a decade or two ago, if you bring it up, you sort of get told, yeah, no, let's focus on the actual thing. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, if I can add a comment to that, if there's anybody, in the audience from the Heritage Foundation or the Koch brothers are here, I just want to say, like, your work worked. They have been funding media narratives for 30, 40, 50 years, pushing out all sorts of stuff on why overpopulation is a myth, why it leads to horrible things. And they have no business talking about it, but they own so many of the media outlets, right? So we have to see also where these narratives are coming from, who's pushing these narratives. As a regular reader, if I would just read something from the Washington Post, which I think is, very reputable, and if I just read it, I'd be like, oh yeah, Washington Post said it. I look at, well, who have been in just the last 1 month, 4 of their op-eds are written by senior fellows from the American Enterprise Institute about why we should be having more children, why population decline is such a crisis. And if you don't learn to identify the sources, you'd say, wow, 4 articles from the Washington Post in 1 month. We must really be experiencing a population collapse crisis at 8 billion people heading toward 10.5 billion people. New York Times is very much speaking that language, right? Vox and The Atlantic, all of them are publishing stuff from these mainstream market fundamentalist folks who have no business talking about population, other than the fact that population growth helps economic growth.
I suppose another point is that I often see that the conversation about population coming from a position of privilege to maintain level of consumption. There's like these people who already have a lot saying, oh, well, we don't need to stop having a lot. We just need to reduce the population, when in fact we need to do both of those things. Yeah.
Yes. And those people still exist. It's not that suddenly the population discourse is all feminist and anti-oppression. All of those people are still there. And yet there are a lot of other people who are talking about need to contract population production and the economy to be within, human and non-human rights-based kind of boundaries, ecological boundaries. So I think it's just, we learn to identify who we seek out our messages from. And that's been a really huge learning curve for me in the last 3-4 years of just looking at who's pushing these ideologies.
Good exchange. Thank you. Murray, please. And welcome.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks very much. I was in and out, sorry, so hopefully this didn't get said and I missed it. But when you just referenced the Koch brothers, 2 resources, 2 books, I think, that are pretty powerful that kind of speak to some of this. One is The Myth of Human Supremacy by Derek Jensen. I don't know if anybody's read that. And then The Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis by Sally Weintraub. I think that's, or Trobe is how you pronounce her name. And the bottom of that is The Neoliberal Exceptionalism and the Culture of Uncare, how the climate is treated. And there's a quote in there that stood out for me, not from her, from somebody else, that we treat the earth like a breast toilet. We use the resources and then we dump the garbage, expecting the earth to take care of itself and take care of us. And I thought that those were pretty powerful. And they talk about how people like the Koch brothers and others have gotten their message in there. And it's not a positive one and it doesn't help us. And then to change the focus just a tiny bit, when you talked about having more and more babies, I wonder, and I could be wrong, I hope I'm wrong on this, but is that why some places say they give no exception for rape or incest? Because they want to make sure people have children no matter what. That's pretty dark, and I hope that's not true. But with coerced pregnancy and childbearing, it's a sad commentary on human beings doing that to other human beings, but the impact we're having on the other creatures on Earth. And one other thing, I think it's a stain on us as human beings when creatures continue to disappear from the face of the earth And we're responsible for that. It's not because of them, it's because of us and what we do in our actions. So hopefully, food for thought and things we can do. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Murray. And I do have a response to your query about, the dark prospect of abortion bans and the no exceptions for rape and incest or really for anything. I don't think it's a dark thought. I think it's a dark reality. I wrote an article right after the Dobbs decision called "Abortion Bans Are a Natural Outgrowth of Coercive Pronatalism." When child tax credits, when bonuses, when awards, and all these bribery types of gifts and things that governments do to compel people to have more children for the state, when they fail to work, they turn to coercive measures to ensure that people have children. And it's not like a philosophical thought that I had to write that. There is so much literature on the kinds of conversations that are happening in the conservative CPAC, whatever that stands for, where they're actually literally talking about instituting abortion bans as a means to grow populations. There is a whole network of far-right nationalists within the UK who, now inspired by the US, have started a whole network of people who are now funding far-right politicians who will put such things in effect so that the nationalism that's driving a lot of these kind of far-right narratives can be kept alive, and more kind of native people have children rather than bringing in climate refugees or war refugees or migrants, etc. So the nationalism, the xenophobia, the polarization is very much at play when it comes to pronatalism. And it truly is an extension. This is what people will do. The Margaret Atwood book, The Handmaid's Tale, is not, it's like, it's a dystopian novel, but that is based on, in her words, historical events. She's not predicting something that's happening. She's basing it on what's happened in history over millennia. So it's a dark reality, but it is true.
Can I ask you an identity-based question in that? Adam referenced his thoughts about the people who want to talk about this are old men in their 70s. Let's not diss old men. But old men white men in their 70s talking about other people. You're kind of the opposite of that. You'd be constructed as a person of color from the global South, South Asia, Indian, if I recall correctly. Mm-hmm. And how does that impact your conversations with people, especially people who are people who are engaged in overpopulation denialism? Does that impact your conversation with them in any way, shape, or form?
First, I second your claim to not diss old white men, because there are, look at one of my favorite people that I keep referring to is Dr. Bill Reese. He has informed so much of my ecological thinking to move beyond human exceptionalism. A lot of people that we've interviewed fall into that category. And I think the same could be said about really anybody, because there are people in different political and ethnic identities who could be thinking in those ways too, in negative ways, right? About like racism and ethnocentrism. Yeah. Ethnocentrism is not just a white supremacy issue. It's an issue in almost all cultures who think their ethnicity is the best. Okay, so the second question about, my own identity, I didn't even come to this work because I thought I had an edge over other people to talk about this. I came to it so naturally because I was really concerned about the environment, nature, non-human animals, and about just reproductive injustice that was happening in the name of population growth. But I did find over the years of doing presentations, I think, unfortunately, because of the political identity narratives of the time, more people are willing to listen to someone who looks like me. But I think not just because of my looks or like my physical appearance, I think it's because my story is based in reality. For me, it was a true visceral experience that I bring up of living in India, being a kind of a product of patriarchal pronatalism where I didn't even know that not having children was an option because I'd never met anyone in India who didn't. Or if they didn't, it's because they couldn't and they were pitied. So it was like, obviously, everybody has to have children. So I think that is more at play because I have been in presentations where I have been, very few, but I have been, said that I'm promoting a white supremacist agenda and that I haven't really done real work in looking at my own privilege. So I don't think I'm immune to the negative aspects of that discourse. So I think I'll leave it at that. Yeah, I mean, I think when whoever is talking, I think it is really up to all of us to look at not the appearance or their, age, gender, race, whenever they're talking about a subject. To me, what's important is we're looking at the work that each individual has done in understanding their place in this world, their own privilege, and all of the different hierarchies they've participated in. And if you've done the real work, then I think and if you have something important to say, I think we need to really have a diversity of voices. I think elevating certain people over other has caused us real harm in suppressing a real critical, diverse set of views at the table. And someone like Dr. Bill Reese is not listened to by a lot of people. He's been called lots of bad names because he is old, white, Canadian, and yet he's one of the most incredible, empathetic, authentic people I know, who cares deeply about racial justice and social justice and ecological justice. So that's a difficult conversation, I think, for many people to have.
Yeah, that's especially difficult these days, without a doubt. Adam, you wanted to jump back in here?
Yeah, only if no one else has a question.
I don't see any hands up. People, don't hesitate to click the raise hand buttons because we really do want to hear from you, and your voices will really add to this conversation.
I'm learning I'm a hidden Koch brother spy from within Pan community and to myself. Actually, I'm a plant. I'm a plant. So this, and I asked this question just for discussion, not necessarily because I think it's because I believe the techno-futurism sort of stuff that is happening at the moment, or the discussions that are happening. But I think there's this interesting, they're always part of narratives around this stuff, I think. And there's two branches occurring at the moment. There's the, Elon Musk, who's talking about multi-planetary species, which I think may be part of his sort of worldview, which is about, in his own life, populating the earth and having more and more people, driven by this, a consumerist and materialist sort of global society that we seem to be pushing for, and that humans are, as you mentioned, humans are the most valuable commodity. So continue to grow, but we can look after Earth or escape the collapse of Earth by going multiplanetary. So that's one that sort of supports just a growth thing, and maybe gives people an out. Well, we don't need to stop growing the population because we'll be multiplanetary soon. And then there's the other stuff that's happening at the moment. And again, not that I think that it's about to happen, but maybe is the potential for AGI plus robotics having the possibility of replacing human labor in many places, and that shifting that calculus where humans are the most valuable commodity to something else being a more valuable commodity. But if you can create the products, create the material through other labor that's not human labor, does that actually open up an opportunity for a reduction in human population, a discussion around, because the materialist and consumerist sort of calculus does not need necessarily the human bodies to create the products, although perhaps they need them to consume them. But if it's about building capital towards the top, I don't know. Be interested in your thoughts on these two different techno futures and how they relate or influence discussions around overpopulation.
Yeah. So interestingly, the people who are, there's two types of techno tribes, I would say. One is the real Elon Musk, long-termist, effective altruist type who actually believe in technological fundamentalism, that we need to, we in our human form are not enough. Animals are, just kind of seen as commodities. Anyway, it's a real human supremacist worldview within that, even though, there are some EA folks who tend to support some type of animal welfareism, but EA and effective altruists, and long-termists, and Elon Musk, who aligns very much with long-termist philosophy, they are both pushing the gas and the brake at the same time because they want more technology, but they also want more people, right? They are actually pushing for population growth because they want the population to colonize whatever in their dystopian fantasies, other planets. We actually did a whole episode with Emil Torres, who has done a really deep critique of these tech billionaires and their really ecologically kind of ungrounded fantasies of planetary colonization, like multiplanetary colonization. It sounds like so conspiracy theorist when we talk about it, but there's billions of dollars behind this kind of narrative. Elon Musk alone is pushing so much money toward pronatalist policies, toward taking away reproductive rights, toward this fertility decline narrative, but so are long-termists and effective altruists. And so that's the one tribe that I think we should be really concerned about, deeply concerned about, because though they might sound like fantasies, science fiction, these are people with a lot of money and a lot of power, and they're working in big academic institutions, influencing a lot of academia and government's policies. But I also want to talk about mainstream technological fundamentalism. So these are just regular environmentalists, people who care about climate change, people who want to do something in the next 30, 40 years to really mitigate the harmful impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, toxification, etc., who also engage in the ideology of technological fundamentalism or technological solutionism, where without kind of taking a moment to recognize that so many of the problems of today exist because of the technologies that we have created. We think that more technologies are going to help solve the problems that previous technologies have created. So it's a form of hubris, and it's a form of like lack of humility to say, we cannot keep managing nature. We have to, at some point, acknowledge that there are limits to our growth, that we are part of nature, that we cannot, bring back the dodo through technological, prowess of humanity, because that is like the God complex that currently human beings are engaging in. Is this went extinct, we can bring this back. Too many here, we can cull some, maintain some. What's the right population of this species versus that? It's still very much kind of based in, we are in control, we are in power, nature is to be dominated, it's a human colony. And there's a great interview we did with Robert Jensen, where he talks about technological fundamentalism, and he's written a lot of articles about it, and it's a really like humbling way of looking at. You're looking at technology as this panacea that is going to save us, instead of just saying, what's going to save us is to pull back and scale down our impact, our population, our production, our consumption, because we could create all of these AGIs to create all of these things for us, but where is the human connection in that? Which is the one thing we have been missing. Where is our connection to nature and non-human animals? Isn't that what we're here for? Are we really just here for like more intelligent gadgets and stuff to plunder the earth with? So I moved from being a technological fundamentalist, from teaching about technology saving the world, to now really looking at ourselves with a little more humility and saying, let's look at it from this precautionary principle, from the law of unintended consequences, to see what role does this technology really play in helping us move forward? What are the unintended consequences of such and such technologies? I hope that's helpful.
I think that's a wonderful summation. And we're also over time. And I think it's a wonderful place for us to end this section of the podcast. So let me just say thank you so much for taking your evening and sharing with us all this amazing information. Thank also the audience for being here and being part of this live stream. Join us later in the month when Nicole Roberts is going to be speaking, who's a PAN fellow. She's going to be speaking about building ethical capacity in wildlife agencies. And with that, we'll call this pod to a close. That's a wrap. Pan Thinks is a production of PanWorks, an ethics, science, and policy think tank for the well-being of animals. It is edited and produced by Gary Shear with the help of Bill Lynn. To learn more about PanWorks, visit our website at panworks.io. To donate to our work, please visit our support page on our website. Until next time, this is PanWorks, bringing ethics to life.